The moment Stephen Holt's face turned pale, I knew it was over. Not the trial. The plan my father and brother had spent months putting together. Holt was the most sought-after probate attorney in the Pacific Northwest. He had never walked into a courtroom without believing he was going to win. But that morning, in courtroom 7 of the Multnomah County Courthouse in Portland, he stood frozen like a man watching a disaster race straight toward him. All because of a single file. Judge Patricia Wyndham opened it. She turned one page, then another. The entire courtroom fell silent. My father sat upright, radiating confidence. My brother still wore the smile of a man who thought victory was already his. Neither of them realized that everything was about to collapse. Then the judge looked up and said a sentence that seemed to freeze the air in the room. Miss Reeves does not require legal counsel. I still remember the sound that followed those words. Not the strike of a gavel. Not the rustle of papers. But silence. A silence so heavy it felt almost audible. Connor blinked. My father frowned. And Stephen Holt, a man whose hourly rate exceeded what most people in that courtroom earned in an entire day, looked across the aisle at me with an expression I will never forget. He was afraid. And when the opposing attorney starts looking afraid, you know you're holding something powerful enough to destroy the entire story they've built. My name is Maya Reeves. I'm 34 years old. And that morning, I walked into that courtroom alone. No attorney. No protector. No one standing beside me. At least, that's what my father and brother believed. What they didn't know was that the biggest secret in this entire case was the woman they had spent a lifetime underestimating. My name is Maya Reeves. The morning I walked into that courtroom alone, I wasn't scared. I was ready. But the woman standing at that defense table did not appear out of nowhere. She was built, slowly, over 34 years, mostly by people who never intended to build her at all. I grew up in Southeast Portland with my father Dennis, my mother Claire, and my older brother Connor. On the surface, we were a functional family. Dinners together, church on Sundays. My father coached Connor's baseball team and arrived at every game with a cooler of Gatorade and the loudest voice in the bleachers. He attended one of my events in 12 years. Nobody ever delivered an official verdict. You learn these things through accumulation, through the specific texture of 1,000 small moments that, taken separately, mean nothing, but stacked together form the architecture of a childhood. Connor forgot his homework. Boys will be boys. I forgot mine. Irresponsible. Connor failed a university course halfway through the semester and my father drove 4 hours to bring him home, telling everyone Connor was reassessing his direction. When I was accepted into a federal training program at 22, my father asked whether the hours were reasonable and changed the subject to Connor's latest business concept before I finished answering. The only person in my family who looked at me the way a person deserves to be looked at was my grandfather. Henry Reeves had spent 30 years as a civil engineer before retiring to manage a quietly accumulated portfolio of real estate investments and what he called the serious work of paying attention. He was not a loud man. He had a stillness that made everything else in a room seem like unnecessary noise. When I was 11, after a family barbecue where my father spent 40 minutes describing Connor's athletic future while I sat at the end of the picnic table with a paperback, Grandpa Henry found me in the backyard and sat down on the steps without announcing himself. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he handed me half his sandwich. "You know what I've noticed about you?" he said. I shook my head. "You notice everything. And you don't waste words on people who aren't listening." He took a sip of his lemonade. "That's not a weakness, Maya. That's the most useful skill a person can have. The world is going to need people like you more than it currently knows." I was 11 years old and had been invisible for most of them. That sentence went somewhere deep and stayed. When I was 22, I joined the FBI's Financial Crimes Division as a forensic analyst. My father told me government work was for people who couldn't compete in the private sector. Connor said I'd be bored inside a year. My grandfather drove 2 hours from Beaverton to take me to dinner the night before I left for training. He ordered deliberately, studied the menu without rushing, looked at me across the table, and said, "Now they're going to see what I've been looking at for 20 years. Over the next decade, I built a career my family never quite asked about. Financial fraud investigations, federal evidence analysis, legal proceedings testimony. I spent years learning how evidence worked, collected, challenged, authenticated, destroyed. I testified in federal courtrooms. I traced patterns across millions of transactions, understood how people hid things they needed, buried, and developed the specific kind of calm that comes from being the person in the room who knows more than anyone expects. My father asked once what I actually did at work. I told him. He nodded and asked whether Connor had mentioned his new consulting idea. That conversation said more than most people manage in a lifetime, And I filed it away the way I filed everything. Grandpa Henry called me every Sunday for 15 years. Sometimes we talked about his investment properties, about something he'd read, about a decision he was reconsidering. Sometimes we talked about nothing in particular, just two people keeping the frequency alive. Those calls became the most consistent relationship I had. The older I got, the more I understood that their value had nothing to do with what either of us owned. 3 years ago, he had a stroke. I drove to the Cedar Ridge facility in Beaverton the morning after I heard. He was propped against the pillows when I arrived, looking smaller than the version of him I carried in my memory, but his eyes were exactly the same. Sharp, quiet, watching. He squeezed my hand. "Still the one who notices everything," he said. I laughed because it was the only alternative to crying. "Trying," I said. He smiled. "Good." Then, looking at the ceiling for a moment, "I did things right with you, Maya. I want you to know that. Whatever comes next." He turned back. "Whatever happens." I didn't fully understand what he was telling me. I do now. He died 11 days later. The funeral was held on a gray February morning in Portland. My father accepted condolences with practiced grace. Connor spent most of the reception near the back of the room scrolling his phone. I stood beside the casket and said goodbye to the only person in my family who had ever chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, to know me. 2 weeks later, we gathered in a law office downtown for the reading of the will. Henry Reeves had accumulated more than anyone realized. Decades of careful investment, property holdings, financial instruments compounded over time. When the attorney reached the distribution section, my father shifted forward. Connor leaned in. Then the attorney read the decision. The primary beneficiary was me. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. I counted because counting things is what I do when I'm managing something difficult. Connor laughed sharp and reflexive, like he'd misheard. Then the attorney confirmed it. And in the next 30 seconds, I watched my father's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and a particular kind of rage that I recognized immediately. The rage of a man confronting information that contradicts a story he has built his identity around. "You manipulated him," he said. The accusation landed in the room like something physical. I stared at him. "You don't actually believe that." "I do." 3 weeks later, they filed suit. Undue influence, fraud, incapacity. Their attorney was Stephen Holt, whose name appeared in Portland Business Journal profiles at least twice a year. I told the court I would represent myself. My father didn't try to hide his reaction. Connor grinned for 3 solid minutes. If you've ever stood in a room where the people who were supposed to know you best looked right past you, if you've ever watched someone write off your capabilities before you've opened your mouth, then you know, the hallway outside courtroom 7, that I was standing in on the first morning of trial. And you know the particular calibration it takes to stay quiet in that moment. Not because you have nothing to say, because you know when to say it. Holt's strategy became clear within the first hour. He wasn't directly arguing incapacity that would have been difficult, given the documentation. He was building a picture. Maya visited frequently. Maya called regularly. Maya was close. Therefore, Maya must have influenced. Elegant, subtle. Designed to plant doubt without making a claim anyone could directly refute. I listened. I took notes. I didn't react. People who represent themselves in court typically make the same mistakes. They argue every point, react to every witness, confuse emotional intensity with strategic effectiveness. I had spent 10 years watching attorneys work in federal proceedings. I knew that the most dangerous person in a courtroom is rarely the loudest one. During the lunch recess on day 1, I found a bench near a window on the 2nd floor. I was reviewing a document when a shadow appeared. Judge Patricia Wyndham. She stopped. "Miss Reeves." A pause. "May I ask, why did you choose to represent yourself?" I thought through the standard answers. Cost, familiarity with the evidence, efficiency. None of them were true. "Because my family has spent 34 years telling me who I am," I said, looking toward the window. I wanted to be in the room the day they had to stop. The judge was quiet for a moment. She was holding a thick file, my personnel record, obtained through standard discovery but clearly reviewed in detail. Several pages were flagged with yellow tabs. Her expression shifted in a way I couldn't fully read. "Courtrooms have a way of surfacing things people work very hard to keep buried," she said. Then she walked away. I sat with that sentence for the rest of the afternoon. I would understand it the following morning. The second day began differently. Judge Wyndham entered carrying 2 files. She settled into her chair and began reviewing pages before the proceedings formally opened. Holt was mid-sentence about an evidentiary matter when she looked up. "Counsel." Her voice was calm but absolute. "I want to address something before we proceed." The room stilled. She opened the thick file. 1 page. Then another. Then another. Her eyes moved steadily, without hurry, in the manner of someone who has already read something once and is now confirming her understanding. Miss Reeves. She looked up at me. You completed advanced federal legal certification through the Department of Justice's Financial Crimes Division. Another page. You testified in 14 federal proceedings over the course of your career. Another page. You led evidence analysis on 3 major fraud investigations, 2 of which resulted in convictions involving sophisticated financial architecture. She placed the file flat on the bench. Then she said it. Miss Reeves doesn't require legal counsel. Nobody moved. Connor blinked. My father frowned. Holt went completely still. Then the judge turned to him directly. Mr. Holt, I want to make sure we're operating with a correct understanding of who is sitting at that table. Holt reached for his copy of my record provided to opposing counsel as part of standard discovery, but clearly unread. His eyes moved down the first page. Then the second. Then they stopped. He went pale. Not gradually. The color simply left. Oh my God. He hadn't meant to say it. The words escaped before the professional layer could intercept them. He looked at the file. Then at me. Then back at the file. My father turned toward him. What? Holt didn't answer immediately. He was still reading. Still recalibrating. Still watching the entire scaffolding of his case shift beneath his feet. Look at what she does, he said quietly. Look at what she does for a living. The confidence in his voice wasn't gone. He was too skilled for that. But it was different now, smaller, more careful. My brother noticed. My father noticed. Neither of them understood why. I want to slow this moment down and stay in it, because it mattered more than the verdict itself. In that instant, something that had existed my entire life, a story my family had told about me, a version of me they had invented and maintained for 34 years, the quiet daughter, the one who didn't quite measure up, the one to be managed and overlooked, that story cracked. Not because I announced a correction. Not because I argued against it. Because reality walked into the room and introduced itself without asking permission. The proceedings resumed. I stood for cross-examination. Holt had called a neighbor of my grandfather's, Evelyn Park, who had known Henry for over 20 years. Under Holt's guidance the day before, she had described the frequency of my visits and claimed that Henry had discussed reconsidering his estate plans following those visits. I approached the stand slowly. Mrs. Park, you testified yesterday that my grandfather discussed reviewing his will on several occasions following my visits, correct? Yes. Can you provide the court with approximate dates for those conversations? She gave 3. I nodded. Then I opened a folder and handed documents to the bailiff. Federal travel records. Time-stamped. Verified and certified. On every date she mentioned, I had been on federal assignment. 2 were in Chicago. 1 was Washington, D.C. None of them were Portland. The witness stared at the papers. Her posture shifted. I may have the timing slightly wrong. You may have, I said. Did my grandfather ever tell you directly that I pressured him about his estate? No. Did you ever personally witness a conversation that concerned you? No. Did he ever seem afraid of my calls, or uncomfortable after we spoke? No. So your testimony is based on an assumption about causation and timing? A pause that lasted a beat too long. Yes. Thank you. I returned to my seat. I didn't look at my father, but I felt the atmosphere in the room change, the specific shift that happens when people who thought they were watching a performance realize they are watching something else entirely. The second witness was Thomas Graydon, a former business associate of Henry's, who had claimed my grandfather seemed increasingly withdrawn and easily influenced during his final year. Under cross-examination, he acknowledged that he had visited Henry exactly twice during those months, for a combined total of less than 30 minutes, and had not spoken with him by phone during the final 18 months of his life. Then your assessment of his mental state is based on 2 visits totaling under an hour, I said. Graydon looked at the ceiling. I suppose it is. Thank you. By mid-afternoon, Connor had stopped smiling. My father's posture had changed, less forward, heavier. Holt was still professional, still controlled, but he was no longer leading the room. He was managing it, containing damage, and the damage kept growing. Then, I requested permission to introduce evidence. The first exhibit was security footage from Cedar Ridge, 18 months of it, legally obtained during discovery, edited to a representative 20-minute sequence. The footage played on the courtroom projector. My grandfather walking the facility's corridors, greeting staff by name, sitting at a table in the common area reviewing documents and making corrections with a pen, holding extended conversations with his financial advisor, asking precise questions, correcting a figure in a spreadsheet and explaining the correction calmly. Nothing in that footage looked like a man being guided. Everything in it looked like a man in full command. The judge watched without expression. The spectators watched. Holt watched with the face of a man who has just seen the strongest plank of his argument dissolve frame by frame. When the footage ended, I spoke. The plaintiffs have repeatedly implied my grandfather lacked the independent judgment required to make autonomous estate decisions. The evidence suggests otherwise. The judge nodded. Agreed. Then came the financial records. 8 years of them. Bank statements, transfer documents, personal loan agreements, promissory notes, cleared credit balances. I had organized everything chronologically and cross-referenced it against the estate's final accounting. The total amount Henry Reeves had provided to my father and brother over those 8 years loans, business rescues, personal debt clearances, advance payments appeared on the projector screen in a single number. The courtroom went quiet. The number was significant. Very significant. Almost none of it appeared in any repayment documentation. Every time Connor's venture failed, Henry had written a check. Every time my father needed a bridge, Henry had extended one. The pattern ran uninterrupted across 8 years, methodical, patient, and in the context of this courtroom, devastating. Would either plaintiff like to dispute the accuracy of these records? I asked. They were obtained directly from the financial institutions, all certified. Neither spoke. Then I showed the emails. I had found them during my review of Henry's estate documents, messages between my father and brother going back nearly 3 years. Most were routine family correspondence. But in a thread from 14 months before Henry's death, the subject of the estate appeared. And then again. And then with growing urgency. Connor's words appeared on the projector screen one by one. If the money goes to her, we're finished. Then, in a later message, you need to get to him before she does. Then, 3 weeks before the will was finalized. He can't actually be serious about leaving it to Emily. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Holt closed his eyes. My father stared at the screen. Connor was very still. I let the silence sit for a moment. The emails didn't need commentary. They had been saying the quiet part out loud for 3 years. Then I said, "Your Honor, I have one final exhibit." I had thought carefully about whether to use it. Not because of the legal outcome by that point, the case was settled in every way that mattered. I hesitated because hearing it again would hurt. Even now, even after everything, I pressed play. My grandfather's voice filled courtroom 7. Older than I remembered it, slower, but unmistakably his. A legal witness present at the recording's creation asked him, in simple language, to explain his estate decisions in his own words. Henry Reeves cleared his throat. "Maya never asked me for a single thing," he said. "Not once in 34 years. Everything I ever gave her, I gave because I wanted to. Not because she needed it to feel valued." A pause, the sound of him adjusting in his chair. "She called me every Sunday for 15 years. We talked about books, about history, about ideas. She treated me like a person until the very end, not like a resource." His voice slowed slightly. "My son and Connor both love me. I know that, but they love what I can do for them." A longer pause. "Maya loved me before she knew what I had. If anyone deserves this, she does. And if I'm wrong about anything in my life, I don't think I'm wrong about that." The recording ended. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard in a room. Judge Wyndham folded her hands. She looked at Holt. "Counsel, do you wish to continue?" Holt looked at my father. My father stared at the table. Connor had his eyes closed. Neither man spoke. "No, Your Honor." The verdict came the following morning. Will upheld. Petition denied. Court costs assigned to the plaintiffs. And then I placed one final folder on the evidence table, the one I had held back until the end. Not for the case, but for accountability. Financial transfers from Henry's personal accounts made in the 18 months before his death. Significant transfers. Carefully moved. Never disclosed in the estate proceedings. Judge Wyndham reviewed the pages slowly. Her expression shifted in a way that had nothing to do with routine probate process. She directed the clerk to forward the documents for further review. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. Connor turned to my father. "What assets is she talking about?" My father said nothing. "Dad, what is this?" The silence answered everything. And for the first time in his life, Connor was not the favored son. He was simply another person standing beside a man whose choices were now public record. People began gathering their things. The room was emptying when I heard my name, not from Connor, not from Holt. From my father. He was standing a few feet away. He looked older than I had ever seen him look. The confidence was gone. The posture had changed. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had only just acknowledged the weight. "I never thought," he started. Then stopped. "Tried again. I never thought you'd become this. I didn't know. I looked at him for a long moment. The man who had attended one of my events in 12 years. The man who had redirected conversations from my achievements to Connor's plans for 34 years without appearing to notice he was doing it. The man who had taught me, through accumulation, that his version of who I was mattered more than who I actually was. I wasn't angry. Anger requires energy, and I had spent all of mine building something real. You never looked, I said. That was the whole difference. He was quiet for several seconds. Then, very softly, barely above a whisper, I was wrong. 3 words. 34 years late. I want to be honest with you about what those words felt like. They didn't fix anything. They didn't close the distance. Some gaps accumulate interest over decades, and 3 words, however true, however long awaited, cannot settle a 30-year account in an afternoon. But they were real, and they were the first real thing he had ever said to me. He took a step toward me, then another, then his hand moved to his chest. His face changed. First confusion, then something else entirely. He stumbled. His body folded before he reached me, and the sound of it, of my father's body hitting the floor of that courthouse, is something I will carry for a long time. Connor shouted. Several people rushed forward. Someone called for medical assistance. The paramedics arrived quickly, and moved with a focus that left no room for anyone else in the space. I stood a few feet away and watched. Not with satisfaction, not with relief, with the specific helplessness of watching something happen to a person you have a complicated, unfinished history with, and no clear map for how to feel. He survived. I learned that from a doctor in the hospital waiting room. Stable, the word was, which meant alive and unresolved, and still there. The conversation between us sitting open in the air, neither answered nor closed. Some reckonings arrive at exactly the wrong moment to be completed. That is perhaps the hardest truth this story holds. The apology that arrives before the conversation can finish. The bridge extended too late to be fully crossed. The 3 words that were true and real and 34 years overdue, spoken in a courthouse hallway with a cardiac event on the other side of them. I drove home along the Burnside Bridge that evening, the city lit up against the Willamette River, the sky doing what Portland skies do in early spring, somewhere between gray and almost clear. This is what I've carried away from all of it, for whatever it's worth to you. Being invisible is not the same as being nothing. The people who failed to see me clearly were not seeing reality. They were seeing the story they had already decided to tell, and they told it so consistently that, at certain moments in my childhood, I started to believe it too. My grandfather was the exception, not because he was unusually perceptive, but because he was unusually willing to look first and decide afterward. That is a rarer quality than it sounds. If there is someone in your life who sees you that way, who notices before they conclude, who looks without an agenda, protect that relationship with everything you have. The second thing. Competence built in silence is still competence. I did not spend a decade in federal service in order to win a probate case. I built that career because the work mattered, because it gave my life a structure that the approval I'd been chasing never offered. But here's what I've learned about building yourself in the quiet years, without an audience. The building is real whether anyone is watching or not. The day comes when the room gets still enough for the work to speak. On that day, you will not need to introduce yourself. And the third thing is the one I'm still sitting with. Watching someone you love be wrong about you is different from winning an argument about it. When that recording played and my grandfather's voice filled that room, I did not feel victorious. I felt something closer to grief. Because the person I most wanted to hear those words was the one who had said them, and he was already gone. Before I go, I want to ask you something genuine, not a prompt, not a poll. Just a real question that this story left me with. Is there someone in your life right now who made up their mind about you before giving you the chance to show them differently? Not someone cruel. Maybe just someone who stopped looking closely enough to see who you became. Someone who is still carrying a version of you that you outgrew years ago. Because here is what I've learned. You cannot make them look. You can only keep building. And sometimes not always. But sometimes the evidence you build in the quiet years becomes the thing that speaks for itself in the moment that matters most. If that question lands somewhere real for you, I'd like to hear about it. Not a number, not a vote, just a word in the comments, or a line that tells me what it touched. Because the reason I tell stories like this one is not the courtroom drama. It is the person who recognizes something in the waiting. In the years spent becoming something while no one was watching. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. Tell me what time it is there. I read every single comment, not as a formality, but because the people who find these stories at midnight, or early before the house wakes up, are usually the ones carrying something worth hearing. If these stories matter to you, subscribe. Not for the algorithm for the next story, Because there are more people like Maya out there. People who built extraordinary things while the people closest to them looked the other way. I want to keep telling those stories, and I want you here when I do. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Portland, Oregon to create original content. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is entirely coincidental.